Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all so much for being here for Book Sandwiched In. This is our final Book Sandwiched In performance or presentation of the year, and also our final one here at Central Library. You may have heard Book Sandwiched In is on the move. Next year, we are trying a brand new approach to Book Sandwiched In. Same excellent programs, same excellent format, just in a different location and monthly instead of in a six-week burst in the spring and the fall. We sent out a big survey. We had tons of wonderful responses, maybe even from some of you in the audience. And it was an overwhelming desire for Book Sandwiched In to move from downtown. So starting on February 10th, that will be our first one in 2025. And we are doing Orbital, an award-winning book. And we have an incredible speaker coming in all the way from California to do Orbital. That will be February 10th, same time, but at Martin Library. So we will be starting at Martin. We're going to be doing it at Martin. We'll do it once a month for the year, and after a year, we'll see how everybody's feeling about it. So please let us know, but we look forward to seeing all of you at Martin on February 10th. Just keep your eye on the newsletter, keep your eye on our social media page. We will remind you after the hustle and bustle of the holidays, you can get right back in to diving into a good book with Book Sandwiched In. But that is all for next year. Let's close out this year and this series with a bang. And we have an excellent speaker for you, Mr. Adrian Alexander. So Adrian Alexander served as the first McFarland Dean at the TU Library from 2007 until he retired in 2022. He has a degree of library science from University of North Texas and has served in a variety of roles in the library and information industry over the past 40 plus years. So clearly very qualified gentleman. But more importantly today, Mr. Alexander wants us all to know that he has loved reading books. Lots and lots of books from a very young age, as long as he can remember. He is an avid library lover, a holder of a library card, and he is honored to have served as a member of the Helmerich Distinguished Author Award Selection Committee beginning in 2007. And he chaired that committee for 8 years. So this is an excellent person to speak about our Helmerich Award winner. So without further ado, I introduce you to the delightful and brilliant Adrian Alexander.
He sounds like a tough act to follow. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I really am delighted to be back. I always enjoy doing these. As I was telling someone else that when I was chair of the committee and we select a little far in advance, so I could get a head start on these things. And this assignment, after I rejoined the committee following a brief sabbatical, they asked me last summer, and I had some catching up to do. So I'll be the first to tell you I haven't read everything by our distinguished author this time, but what I have read, I've been very impressed by. But I am delighted to be back here doing this. I always enjoy the work, and I'm a historian by background myself, undergraduate degree, but no further. But reading history and historical fiction are two of my favorite subjects. So to have a historian here again, and one like H.W. Brands is going to be a real treat for everyone, I think, as I think you'll see as I talk more about him. So Brands grew up in Portland, Oregon. Just a little background. He graduated from high school as a 3-sport athlete and a National Merit Scholar. He stayed busy, needless to say. He actually, I didn't put this in my notes, but I read something about it. After graduation from high school, from college, he actually, his family had a cutlery business in Portland, and he actually worked for about a year or so as a salesman for his father's company before he decided to go to graduate school. And he actually went into teaching rather at his high school, teaching mathematics. And along the way, while he was teaching math, he earned a master's degree at Reed College in history because he loved history. And then just for the heck of it, he picked up a master's degree in math at Portland State University along the way, all by teaching full-time as a history professor. He ultimately decided on history as a profession, as a teaching career, because he loved writing. And as a mathematician, you're not going to do a whole lot of that. So he chose history, and he went on to University of Texas at Austin, where he completed his PhD work in the 80s. And his doctoral dissertation in 1985 focused on the Eisenhower administration's foreign war policy. What was I going to say next? Oh yeah. So there's something you need to know about historians. If you don't read a lot of history, or even if you do, there are some historians out there who write really well and are great teachers, and then there are some that are great scholars and not great teachers. But I think by my experience, I think the best history teachers are the ones that are good storytellers. And H.W. Brands is a great storyteller. If you've read, who's read any works by Brands now? Would you agree with that? Yeah, he is a great storyteller. So he writes for a general audience better than anybody else that I have ever come across. And I think that ability to tell stories, I had a major professor as an undergraduate who was really good at that and inspired me as a result. And as I mentioned, I was not around. I took a brief sabbatical from the committee after I retired from TU and wasn't around when Brands was selected. Otherwise, I would have been reading some of his work ahead of time. So I had some catching up to do this summer. And fortunately, McFarland Library, where I still have borrowing privileges, had a sizable number of, sizable by comparison to maybe some other historians, but not sizable necessarily in terms of his body of work, because you have a list there, and I have to make one note about that list. The list that I sent to Tara originally, I thought it was just his complete published works. It's longer than that, actually. There are a few entries on there where he's been an editor or he's been a contributor of a chapter or something like that. But in all, he has something like 38 published monographs between 1987 and today. His most recent one just came out this fall. So for someone who teaches full-time and does research to publish that much, especially in areas of history that are beyond your specialty, is pretty unique and pretty impressive that anybody can write that much and write as well as he does. So as I say, he writes across a wide range of American history topics. In fact, the first book that I read by him when I got started was his Ben Franklin biography, which I thought was one of the best that I've read. I'm having trouble. I should have used a bigger font on that. I'm going to need to hold this up so I can see. I started reading that back in the summer. That was the first one I started reading. I was also simultaneously reading a more recent work of his, I think from 2 years ago, called Founding Partisans, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and the Brawling Birth of American Politics. And it tells a fascinating story of how our Constitution came to be finally ratified and adopted, despite many initial and fundamental disagreements among the original 13 states. Now, I found the Franklin biography especially well written and compelling, so much so, in fact, that I'm now of the opinion that Ben Franklin is the real founding father, first true father of our country, I guess I should say, rather than George Washington. When you think about what he did even in colonial times as Pennsylvania's ambassador, if you will, to the court of St. James, all of the colonies had a representative in London at that time. Everything he did from early on until really at the very end, he was still there at a very, very old age for that time at the making of the Constitution. There's no figure from that era in my mind that did more for the country in so many different ways than Ben Franklin did. It's just a remarkable story. And it's a really, really well written book. If there's one biography, if you like biographies, especially American biographies, that's the one I would recommend. I have not read them all, but I've browsed several of them. But this one is so well read. And Franklin is just to me at least, such a fascinating character that I would highly recommend it. So after getting into those two books initially, I just assumed he was an early American historian. Well, he's not. His doctoral dissertation was on Eisenhower and the American foreign policy early years of the foreign war, of the Cold War rather. And it turns out that that was his doctoral dissertation was on the Cold War, and the first few books that he published as a scholar, as a new scholar, you focus on your field of interest and your field of specialization. So his first few books on that list that you'll see have titles like Cold Warriors, Eisenhower's Generation in American Foreign Policy. That was his first book. The Specter of Neutralism, the United States and the Emergence of the Third World, 1947 to 1960. Inside the Cold War, Loy Henderson and the Rise of American Empire, 1918 to 61. Those are just a few of them. But his first 10 books between 1988 and 1995 dealt with this overarching theme of the Cold War and America's role in that contest. His first biography, however, was not related to that area of study at all. It was on Teddy Roosevelt. TR, The Last Romantic, published in 1997, was an exhaustive analysis of Theodore Roosevelt, just over 800 pages, which was described by one reviewer as informative, detailed, and thought-provoking. Brand's next biography would not appear until 2000, and that was the Franklin book I mentioned earlier, First American, The Life and Times of Benjamin Franklin. One reviewer wrote that given its encyclopedic breadth and scholarly bent, I didn't find it that scholarly really, but the First American has largely supplanted Carl Van Doren's 1938 Pulitzer Prize winning classic as the standard biography of Franklin. So it's not just me that thinks it's with 716, felt like 1,700 pages at one point, with 716 pages of text and studious attention to every major facet of Franklin's unusually varied and interesting life. Brand's biography is comprehensive, detailed, and incredibly thoughtful. The same reviewer went on to write that Brand's is able to craft a rich narrative which explores the familiar features of Franklin's life and captures many of the nuances which will have eluded readers who have never undertaken a serious study of the man. So just to follow up on a couple of things I said, I definitely agree with this reader, and it's a big read, but it's very readable. It was to me. And it's got a lot of details about Franklin's life, especially his personal life, his family, that I was completely unaware of. His early years growing up in Massachusetts before moving to Pennsylvania, especially. It's just an outstanding book, and if you have any interest in early American history, I highly recommend it. So the other biographies that he wrote are all about former U.S. presidents. Like I mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt, and his distant cousin Franklin is covered in an 824-page account entitled Traitor to His Class, The Privileged Life and Radical Presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then Andrew Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, and Ronald Reagan all get smaller treatments, while Ulysses S. Grant is accorded a book that is equal to FDR's biography in size, with 736 pages. It's called The Man Who Saved the Union, Ulysses Grant in War and Peace. So if you have any interest in any of these historical figures, Brand's biographies on them are a really good place to look. I'm kind of intrigued by the FDR one. I may get around to reading that one at some point. So the remainder of our author's large body of work can generally be placed in a few broad subject areas. American foreign policy, of course, as I mentioned, and the biographies. But there are some other categories that I've sort of come up with that I think you can fit into just a few little categories. Cold War, as I mentioned, that we talked about. And while it's not technically Cold War, his latest book fits into the era, is an important work in terms of American foreign policy coming out of World War I and going into the facing threat of fascism. I don't know if you read anything about this book that he published. It was supposed to have come out this month, I think, or November actually, but it deals with isolationism. And because once Donald Trump got the nomination this year for the Republican presidency, the Republican candidate, they moved it up to September, and it came out then. It's called America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. It's published by Doubleday. And since Trump is regarded it as by many as an isolationist when it comes to American foreign policy, he did adopt the America First banner, in fact, in his first presidential run. So the book's release, as I mentioned, was moved up. And this book only deals with the American isolationist question just prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it doesn't address any other current views on American isolationism. But it does provide a cautionary tale that's worth understanding at this current moment in history. A reviewer in the Washington Press wrote, Brands does a great job in this work of personifying the debate through its two principal antagonists, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who became the prominent speaker at rallies of the America First Committee, the leading isolationist organization of the period. Brands has described himself as a contrarian by nature, so he takes many of the isolationist claims seriously. He believes that Lindbergh had good reason to contend that the United States was safe at that time from enemy invasion, and that fighting alongside imperialist Britain and communist Soviet Union would be hard to justify simply as a war waged in defense of democracy. But he also notes that Roosevelt understood much better than Lindbergh did that Adolf Hitler would never be appeased and that fascism could only be sustained through armed conflict. So America eventually would go to war sooner or later. At 444 pages, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War is definitely not a short read, but it's written in an easy narrative style that makes the book feel a bit shorter than it actually is. I managed to work that one in right before I started writing, and I'm glad I did. It is an interesting book. There's a lot we don't remember about Lindbergh back then as being so involved in the isolationist, and there's a lot you will learn about what colored some of his views about not just isolationism, but going to war against Germany in particular. Japan, not so much, but there were some issues around Germany that he didn't see any point in fighting Hitler at all. If Hitler was going to take Europe, then that was going to happen, and that shouldn't bother America for whatever reason. So from that standpoint, it's a very intriguing book. Now, the next category that he's written several interesting things in is the American West, totally different from early American history and the Cold War. The first book I'll mention is The Age of Gold, the California Gold Rush and the New American Dream, which was published in 2002 by Doubleday. Pulitzer Prize winning biographer David McCulloch, whom we all know, described this book as a fine, robust telling of one of the greatest adventure stories in history. And then released in 2005, Lone Star Nation, How a Ragged Army of Volunteers Won the Battle for Texas Independence and Changed America, was described in the New York Times Book Review as a balanced, unromanticized account of America's first great epic. I haven't read this one yet, but I plan to at some point because one line of my own family's lineage intersects this major event in Texas and American history. Dreams of El Dorado, published in 2019, is a panoramic story of the settling of the American West. He takes us from John Jacob Astor's fur trading outpost in Oregon to the Texas Revolution, and from the California Gold Rush to the Oklahoma Land Rush. Author Hampton Sides called it epic in its scale, fearless in its scope. I'll have to read it to see how fearless it really is, but it sounds interesting. The Last Campaign, Sherman, Geronimo, and the War for America is a more recent book, just 2 years ago, in which Brands follows the lives of General William Tecumseh Sherman and Apache war leader Geronimo to tell the story of the Indian Wars and the final fight for control of the American continent. One reviewer described the book as gripping and noted that Brands' writing style and his mastery of history make the book an excellent introduction to the time period for newcomers and a fresh perspective for those who are already familiar with this chapter of the nation's history. The next one, interestingly, is Finance and Capitalism. And there are 4 books in this group that sort of struck me as very unexpected, but given the fact that Brands seems to be interested in just about every aspect of American history, I guess I shouldn't have been too surprised. Masters of Enterprise was his first on this topic and the most expansive in scope. It was published in '99, and Brands picked 25 business people across the scope of American history and showed how they are all spiritual descendants of one another. A brief review in Publishers Weekly noted that while John Jacob Astor and Cornelius Vanderbilt would have difficulty understanding the technology behind the companies Andy Grove and Bill Gates built, they would have completely understood their business models. Brands constantly relates what all 25 people profiled have in common. They worked hard, they identify with their work, their desire for success is almost tangible, but perhaps most important, they know exactly what they are trying to create. So if you're interested in entrepreneurs, that sounds like an intriguing book. The Money Men was originally published in 2006 and then reprinted 4 years later. Maybe not such great sales the first time around, I don't know. Here, Brands just explores the role of America in between 1791 and 1907 of a handful of men, including J.P. Morgan, who stabilized a foundering U.S. Treasury in 1907, Alexander Hamilton, who founded the First National Bank, and Nicholas Biddle, under whose directorship it failed, Jay Cooke, who helped finance the Union War effort through his then innovative strategy of selling bonds to ordinary Americans, and Jay Gould, who tried to corner the market on gold in 1869 and as a result brought about Black Friday and fled for his life. In 2010, American Colossus, The Triumph of Capitalism, 1865 to 1900, was published by Doubleday. As described in the marketing blurbs, this book captures the decades between the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century, when a few breathtakingly wealthy businessmen transformed the United States from an agrarian economy to a world power. From the first Pennsylvania oil gushers to the rise of Chicago skyscrapers, the spellbinding narrative shows how men like Morgan, Carnegie, and Rockefeller ushered in a new era of unbridled capitalism. In the end, America achieved unmanageable wealth, but not without a cost to its traditional American democratic values. The review in the New York Times described it as a first-rate narrative history that brilliantly portrays the emergence in a remarkably short time of a recognizably modern America. And finally, in this category, there's a little book, 149 pages only, that was published in 2011 by the University of Texas Press and has the delightful title, Greenback Planet, How the Dollar Conquered the World and Threatened Civilization as We Know It. Telling the story with the verve of a novelist, says the publisher, the author recounts key episodes in U.S. monetary history, from the Civil War debate over fiat money, what they called greenbacks then, to the recent worldwide financial crisis. Brands explores the dollar's changing relations to gold and silver and to other currencies, and cogently explains how America's economic might made the dollar the fundamental standard in world finance. And then I'm not going to get into every book because there are so many in the time we have, but I picked out a few in that I put into a category called Most of the Rest, because they really kind of all over the place, but they're all very intriguing and might be of interest. Oh, this is my last page over here. So these are outliers that kind of define the strict categorization that we librarians really love. And so they're kind of intriguing. The first one has a really intriguing title, The Murder of Jim Fisk for the Love of Josie Mansfield, A Tragedy of the Gilded Age. It was published in 2011, and the publisher Anchor Press wrote that even before he was shot dead on the stairway of the Tony Grand Central Hotel in 1872, financier James Jubilee Jim Fisk Jr. was a notorious New York City figure. From his audacious attempt to corner the gold market in 1869 to his battle for control of the geographically crucial Erie Railroad, Fisk was a flamboyant exemplar of a new financial era marked by volatile fortunes and unprecedented greed and corruption. But it was his scandalously open affair with a showgirl named Josie Mansfield that ultimately led to his demise. I guess you'll have to read the book to find out who killed Jubilee Jim. But this book was the first in a series that Anchor Press, the publisher, had started called American Portraits. And the second book in the series was also by our author and published in 2012. And those were the only two books in the series. I guess it didn't catch hold with readers, so it ended with those two. And Yeah, the next one, The Heartbreak of Aaron Burr, was the second book in the portrait. It tells us more about that man than mostly known today than just Alexander Hamilton's killer in 1804 in the duel. According to the author, Burr was a man before his time, a proponent of equality between the sexes, well over a century before women were even able to vote in the US. Through Burr's extensive witty correspondence with his daughter, Theodosia, Brands traces the arc of a scandalous political career in the early years of American politics. The Heartbreak of Aaron Burr not only dramatizes through their words his eventful life, it also tells a touching story of a father's love for his exceptional daughter, which endured through public shame, bankruptcy, and exile, and outlasted even Theodosia's tragic disappearance at sea. That one sounds kind of interesting, actually. The next book, with a very long title, is Heirs to the Founders, the epic rivalry of Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, the second generation of American giants. It was published in 2018 and was described as the Christian Science Monitor as a historical spellbinder that focuses on these three powerhouses in the US Congress from the 1820s to 1852. And the publisher describes them this way. Together with these heirs of Washington, Jefferson, and Adams, took the country to war, battled one another for the presidency, and set themselves to the task of finishing the work the founders had left undone. Their rise was marked by dramatic duels, fierce debates, scandal, and political betrayal. Yet each in his own way sought to remedy the two glaring flaws in the Constitution: its refusal to specify where authority ultimately rested with the states or the nation, and its unwillingness to address the essential compatibility of republicanism and slavery. And then finally, in this category, there's The Zealot and the Emancipator from 2019, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. And it's described by the publisher as a page-turning account of the epic struggle over slavery that as embodied by John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, two men moved to radically different acts to confront our nation's gravest sin, and a thrilling account of how two American giants shaped the war for freedom. So just to wrap up real quickly, I have to say that all the reading and research that I have been able to do on Brands' impressive body of work has me even more excited at finally getting to meet him in person and listening to him talk this weekend about his work. And I hope you'll be able to come to the public event if you're not coming to the gala. As I've seen on a couple of videos, he's probably he must be a great lecturer he was on CBS Sunday Morning over the weekend. I don't know did anybody catch that by any chance? What did you think? Really good. I think he's going to be a great speaker. So I encourage everyone who can come to try to make it to one of those events. I'm looking forward to myself. And I thank you again for the opportunity. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that anybody might have. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things I really enjoyed about America First, a lot of times people thought that Lindbergh was just a Nazi. They just quickly put that label on him. But when you read the book, I felt like that he wasn't the awful person that some people had been.
Yeah, I tend to agree. The only thing that bothered me in particular about his view toward Germany becoming the dominant power in Europe was he had a dim view. He sort of brushed off the Jews as really not an important issue. As it turned out, it was a very important issue. He was very naive, I think, in that regard, and but his isolationism really came from a place in America at that time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, after so many people from Germany and the Scandinavian countries had migrated to America and settled in Canada, but also in the Middle West, what we would call now. And they were very isolationist. And it was just because they grew up on a continent where war was constantly going on for generations and generations between monarchies. The Napoleonic period brought all of Europe to war. And that was the first big war like that on that continent before World War I. There were some others between France and Germany were always at odds about something. But so many of those people came over just to find a new life and get away from all this. So they were very much in favor of America not getting involved unless America was truly threatened by someone else. And they felt like because we were a separate continent, we were pretty safe from getting involved. That sort of changed with the Spanish-American War when we became in charge of the Philippines and Guam and the Marianas Islands and Cuba and places like, but farther afield, then we had a new potential threat in the Far East to deal with. And little, I think early on, there was no reason in the 30s certainly to think that Japan and Germany would ever become partners in some sort of world conquest where they would divvy up the spoils. So that a lot of the isolationist feelings, and Brands, I think, points that out in the book, were well founded and had justification to them. So it was, if Adolf Hitler had not come on the scene, it would have been a totally different question, I think. Carrie.
Doctor, what, as a librarian, why was such a prolific writer in our library? I was surprised by this.
I would say that in a perfect world with the right resources, we would have had, when he first started publishing in the late 80s, early 90s, and we have some of those books. It depends a lot. I know when I came to McFarland in 2007, we didn't have a lot of bibliographers that could focus on different subject areas and work directly with faculty. We had Andy Lupardis was the closest thing we had, and she worked mostly with the College of Arts and Sciences. But we've depended mostly on faculty for recommendations. So you'll see some areas of the collection where we're very, very strong in Russian history, for example, because we had a husband and wife team in that department for a long time. Our American West collection and Native American collections are strong because Special Collections was certainly strong in that area, but we had an endowed chair in Western American history with Jim Ronda and then eventually with Brian Hosmer after that. So faculty, especially in the social sciences and humanities, play a really fundamental role, but I think it's the same in the other colleges as well. So if you don't, there was a time when I started out when we would do a lot of selection, we would do it in consultation with faculty, but in the first library I worked in at North Texas State after I finished my master's, I was the assistant humanities librarian. So I worked with a lot of faculty in that area, and we would get book slips from the book dealers that we dealt with. Many of those companies are gone now. It's all direct from the publisher or through big houses. And I would send them some of the book slips so they would come over to look at the new, I'd say, we've got some new things in if you want to come look, because we had approval plans where they would send us books from the publisher and faculty would come in and decide, and we would work with them on getting those books. But the approval plans had gone away for the most part by the time I was at McFarland. So, and I know they used them at one time, but all libraries were going through that change. So we relied more and more on the faculty. So wherever their research strengths were, was where the collections went. So. I still have to go back to the Ben Franklin biography. I just thought, and after especially reading about the recommendation that one reviewer said it's even better than the Pulitzer Prize winning book by Carl Van Doren, which has endured since the 30s. It's been around a long, long time. It's just a really, really, and Franklin's such an intriguing character anyway. There were so many facets to his life that a lot of people, I think, don't know about. And he did so many different things. Before he arrived the first time in France, he was already well known over there because of his experiments in electricity and because of other writings he had done. He was a celebrity really in Europe before he was one in the United States. So that's the number one on my list that I've read so far. But if there are some other good books on the list, if you have other interests in American history, there are some other good books that are on that list that you could take a look at. But that's the one I would go with. Anyone else How are we doing on time? Who else has read? Anybody else have a Brand's recommendation other than Ben Franklin? Nope. Going once, going twice. Well, thank you again. This was a privilege. I enjoyed talking with you.